All right, we'll change the view. Okay, so we are chapter 18. We start a new parsha. This is progress again. Okay, so this is immediately after, you'll recall from last week, Abraham's circumcision. God commanded him, reaffirmed the covenant, and in the process asked Avraham, now Avraham, to, as his part in this pact that they're making, this will be the sign of it, and he will create the sign, and it will be in the flesh for all generations. So we're going to look now at what, at least in the text, comes next. I want to caution you that the general principle is we cannot assume in the Torah that what comes before, what comes after, comes immediately after what came before. Right? It's a rabbinic principle, ein mukdam u'mu'achar b'Torah. There's no earlier or later. Things are for specific reasons, which we can sometimes discern out of order. The exception is when it says, as we'll see, I think this morning, after these things, achar hadvarim ha'ela, there we're being told, hey, this came first and this came second. Now, why am I emphasizing that in this case? Let's look at chapter 18. We are at the very beginning of chapter 18. And the first line, which I am not wearing my glasses, so I can't read the. Ironically, getting cataract surgery made me a poor reader for things that are close up. Okay. Vayera elav Adonai be'elonei Mamre. And God appeared to Abraham at the terebinth of Mamre, which is the place he generally hung out. V'haya yoshev petach ha'ochel kichom hayom. And he, meaning Abraham, was sitting in the entrance to the tent in the heat of the day. So God appears to Abraham. And the rabbis, in this case, want to say, yes, it's in. And the reason they want to say that is that they find here in this sentence the origins of Bikur Cholim, the Jewish mitzvah of visiting the sick. Why does God appear to Abraham here? Well, we'll see other reasons too. But in terms of the rabbinic imagination, God is there, of course, to do what Jews do, which is to pay a sick visit. There's a famous midrash in which the rabbis interpret the statement that we should cling to God and follow God's ways. And they say, well, how can you cling to God? God is this devouring fire. No one can even see God and live. And the answer is we imitate God's actions. And we're given three examples in that midrash of God's actions. The first one is that, and we studied this not that long ago, Adam and Eve, as they exit the garden, God gives them clothing. Just as God clothed the naked, so we should clothe the naked. Here, as God visits the sick, we should also visit the sick. And the final one is at the very end when Moses is buried at the end of his life, and there's no one else on the mountain to do it. So the rabbi said, well, God buried Moses, just as God attended to the burial needs of people, so we too should attend to their burial needs. You may be aware, I actually had reason to use their services once. There's something called the Hebrew Free Burial Society in New York, which really performs this mitzvah. in a profound way. And I did have occasions. It had an indigent person I knew, and I worked with them in order to get him a proper Jewish burial at no cost. So it's a very worthwhile organization, and I really urge you to contribute in honor of this passage that we're studying now. Okay, so it's not exactly clear what it means God appeared, and other than visiting the sick, why God might do it, but God is there, and then it's not clear whether this verse and the next verse are in sequence. God appears, and then it says that Yisavena, that Abraham lifts his eyes and he sees three men standing near him. And these are anashim, they're men. These are not described, as we had just seen, as malachim, as angels, right? These are men, three men. And what does he do? They're standing as soon as he saw them, right? But Yaratz Likvatam, he ran to greet them from the entrance of the tent, bowing to the ground, right? So coming back to the fact that he's in the entrance to the tent, according to the Midrash, Abraham has entrances in every direction, so that he can see people coming from wherever, because just like God, who is visiting the sick, Abraham is a master of hospitality, another Jewish value, hachnosat orchim. And the text that we are going to look at, both this and the text about Sodom and Gomorrah, are largely about hospitality. The Abraham as the master of hospitality, the exemplar par excellence of what it means to be hospitable, and then the inhabitants of Sodom, who are quite something else. So what does it mean if we read these verses in sequence? It means Abraham, as it were, turned his back on God to go and greet these three strangers. And that is one way that the Midrash reads it, that so important is the hospitality, the mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim, that it is what God would want him to do. Just wait here for a minute, God. I got to go take care of these guys. I will be back to you, right? So what does he do? He addresses them, my lords, and it's Adonai here, but it's clearly not meant as a reference to God, right? Which Adonai means my Lord in the sense that God is a euphemism for saying God's name. Here it is simply, but he shows them great respect. He bows before them, right? And he says, if it please you, do not go past your servant, calls himself a servant, right? This is real. He's humbling himself before them. Remember that these are just strangers. These are not angels. These are people just coming by the way. And what does he do? He says, if it's okay, let a little water be brought, bathe your feet, recline under the tree. And then he says, Ve'ekach pat lechem. I'll bring you a little bread so that you can refresh yourself and go on your way since you're here. So Abraham is eager to offer hospitality. There's a famous statement in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Father. I know, Sandy, you know these texts well. And that is, I think it is in the name of Shammai, I'm not positive. Say little and do much. And whenever I read this passage, I think of that, because that's exactly what he does at this point. Yeah, rest up. We'll give you a little water and some bread. So what does he do? V'yimaher Avraham, he rushes. He rushes to Sarah and he says, quick, choice flour, knead, make cakes, right? This is, she's going to make pita. Right? If you've ever seen pita made, particularly if you're in Israel, I was once hiking in the Sinai when the Sinai was still part of Israel, came down from what was, according to tradition, Mount Sinai, though it probably wasn't, and there was this Bedouin at the bottom of the mountain, and you could pay him for a pita, which he made on a rock right in front of you. And he took a little flour, rolled it up, put it on the pita, spread it out, took it off. It was ready. So the idea here of taking flour and making bread, you should understand, is a very quick process. Now, he is not ordering her because she's the woman and he's the man, because he himself runs. He takes a calf from the herd, tender and choice. Now, calves are very expensive, right? You think about it, the animal grows up, you get a lot more meat. Right? So the idea of taking this young, but the young animal's meat is much more tender. And so he does this, gives it to a servant boy to prepare. He then takes curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared, right? So it's all quick. He sets it before them and he waits on them under the tree. So he doesn't even eat with them, right? He becomes the meltzar. He's the waiter. Everything okay? Can I get you more this, that, right? He is in a very supplicant kind of mode for these complete strangers, right? So giving them a choice meal, promising them nothing really. And we see in this, it's an extreme example of what it means to be completely hospitable to strangers, Bring out your best china, right? Serve them the delicacies. Okay, so I'm going to, before we go on to what they have to say, let me just pause for a minute. Questions or comments on these two little encounters, first with God, then with the angels? Sandy, go ahead.
So I read somewhere, I don't remember where, that because this meal has milk and meat, that supposedly they drank the milk first. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's nonsense, right? But I'm glad you raised the issue for two reasons. First of all, the commandment not to mix milk and meat, which is actually only not to see the kid in its mother's milk, not something which is being done here, but the Jewish tradition expands it, as you know, to not having milk and meat, comes at Sinai. This is way after the time of Abraham. Now, there is an attempt to, in the Midrash, to say, well, of course, the ancestors observed every bit of the 613 commandments, because could you imagine there's a famous joke about this, which is, how do we know that Abraham wore a shtreimel? A shtreimel is one of these big Hasidic hats. And how do we know? What? Avram Avinu would go out without his shtreimel? Right? It's that kind of thinking, right? But in terms of the shot of the text, clearly this is not a concern. Another thing is doesn't seem to be concerned is that angels eat, or these men who turn out to be angels, right? They eat, not problematic at all. Later on, it seems to be in some contexts, but here they're like, great. The final thing I will tell you is a midrash which relates, Sandy, to your question, and that is a story about Moses on the top of Mount Sinai. And as you're familiar, probably, he gets he goes up there to get the Torah, and the angels don't want him to have it. Right? There's that battle between the two of them. This precious treasure, how can you give it to human beings? And one of the arguments they make in this particular midrash is, you're going to give them the law, they're only going to mess it up. Right? So how can you do that? You'll get angry, it'll be terrible. So God in this midrash says, hey, you guys ate milk and meat together. What are you talking about them messing it up? Right? I don't think the point of that midrash really is that it was a problem here. But okay. So thanks for the question. Any other questions? Otherwise, we move on to what might be called the Annunciation. Right? As the announcement is made here first to Abraham, and then Sarah will come out, and he will be told, first they say, where's Sarah? So immediately, we know that these are not just three guys who happen to be traveling, because how do they know her name? Right, so that's our first tip-off, really, something more than this. And he says, she's in the tent. And then one of them says, I will return to you next year, and your wife will have a son. Right? This remarkable message. Now we know why they're there. God is there, maybe Bikor Cholim, but they are there because they have this announcement to make. And now we understand that they are godly messengers, right? And Sarah, who's listening, eavesdropping, if you will, by the entrance to the tent, and by the way, just in case you forgot, they're really old, says the text. And in fact, they are so old that Sarah no longer gets her period, right? So she's done, bearing children. All right, so what we're talking about here is a miracle that is being predicted, right? By the way, I think that when Jews say that the virgin birth is ridiculous and laughable, they have to explain what they do with this, right? Now, it's true that Sarah is not a virgin, but really, if we're going to talk about a miraculous birth, we have them. Be that as it may, and I think, by the way, the whole tradition that she was a virgin is a misreading of a verse in Isaiah by the Latin translation, which read the word na'ara, young woman will give birth, as bitula, a virgin will give birth. But all that aside, even if you read it as a tradition, okay. So Sarah then laughs to herself, right? Bikirba, within herself, not audible. And she says, now that I am withered, right? Am I to have enjoyment with my husband so old? Right? So she's withered and he's an old guy. Now, how do we interpret Sarah's laughter? Is it the laughter of joy? Is it sarcastic, ridiculous? Who do these guys think they are? It's very hard to understand, but of course, this laughter will become important because it will be the name Yitzchak. Laughter will be the name of the son who is, as predicted, born to them. So the Lord says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Saying, shall I in truth bear a child as old as I am? Is anything too wondrous for the Lord? I will return to you at the same season next year, and Sarah will have a son. So first of all, he hears this stranger, even though it's bikirba, even though it's not audible. And he says to Abraham, he says, why did Sarah laugh and say, I am too old? Well, actually, not an accurate quotation. Looking back, she said, I am withered and my husband is so old. So when this angel, who is understood to be representing God here, says this, he is lying by omission, right? Quoting, but not completely, something that politicians seems to be very fond of doing, right? But be that as it may. So the rabbis pick up on this and they ask the question, God lied? And the answer they give is yes, for the sake of shalom bayit, right? Because doesn't want to introduce the idea into their marriage that Abraham is old, unfertile, impotent. It doesn't mention it, right? Which I think there's a whole debate among the rabbis and classically between Hillel and Shammai as to whether or not you can tell white lies. And the case that's given is, what do you say to an ugly bride? Very explicit. And the answer, Hillel says, you praise her beauty. Every woman is beautiful on her wedding day, you could say, right? Shammai says, you find something. She has nice feet. She has, the idea that you have to be truthful. Absolutely. Hillel wins this argument. White lies to spare people's feelings are okay. And God becomes, now, where do we draw the line? That's a very hard question to answer. It's very situational, right? But I think it's really interesting that from the rabbinic point of view, God who is truth, the embodiment of truth, Adonai Elohechem Emet, your God is truth. Yeah, here, there is a higher value than truth, and it is something as simple as family harmony. I think is really, this leads to another question, which I will not mention. Okay. So Sarah then lies. She says, I didn't laugh because she's afraid. Well, why is she afraid? How did they hear her? And if they could hear her, what will they do to her? Right? So but he replies, you did laugh. All right, that's the last word. Okay, so now we are finished with the exemplar of hospitality, Abraham and Sarah, and we've had the annunciation to Sarah. And we're about to go down into Sodom and Gomorrah, but first we'll have a very famous scene of haggling. Before we do, I left that the way it was, didn't I? Okay. Any question about this scene or any of the rabbinic midrash on it? Otherwise, we're moving on. Great. Okay. So we're at verse 22. Okay. So the men set out from there down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked with them to see them off. Another classic part of hospitality. You don't leave your guests at the door. You escort them on their way. Walk them up. I guess if they're leaving your house, you walk them to the curb. Right? And this is all in terms of the laws of Hachnasat Orchim, which we do find codified. This is one of the elements. Okay. Now God said, should I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Right? So God said, I got to tell Abraham what I'm going to do. Why? Because he is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the world are to bless themselves by him. I have singled him out that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep of the way of the Lord, which by doing what is right, in order that the Lord may bring about for Abram what he promised him. So God is saying, Abraham has to see what I'm going to do, because he is supposed to live a life, and his children, which will be exemplary. That they will lead righteous lives. And I think the extension of that is people will see that, they'll see the value of it. And that's why I have chosen him. So I can't just do this. I can't just go to Sodom and Gomorrah and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah without providing him with context, which I think in itself is extremely interesting, that God cares about. So what does he do? God says, now in verse 20, right? Za'akat Sodom v'Gomorrah, it says the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is so great, but Za'akat is the outcry, right? In other words, the people who have been abused by the immoral behavior have cried out, and God has heard their cry. The language here really is hearing the cry of the oppressed, and therefore, what does God say? Because it's great, because their sin is great, and then he says, Aradana, I will go down to see whether they have acted altogether according to the outcry which has reached me, and if not, I will take note. So what God is telling Abraham is, when you deal with evildoers, you got to get the facts. Even though, as it were, God knows, right? But you got to go, the outcry has come out. There needs to be evidence. Here you're beginning to see a kind of modeling of Jewish justice. Remember that witnesses are required in a Beit Din, in the Jewish court, and so on. It's not just enough to have hearsay evidence. And here, now, the other thing that's happening here is that we seem to now have who is going to go down are angels. Presumably, the angels, or two of them, because it said they went down, right? It said two of them headed, the men sat down from there and looked towards Sodom. And Abraham saw them. So they seem to be going, the two, right? And yet when they get there, God says, I will look. And now they seem to be angels, as we'll see in the story. So it's not this idea of God and angels, as we talked about last time. There seems to be a fluidity between them. Someone once said, a professor said that the angels become avatars of God, right? Somehow representing or part of, it's not really clear. And you see that kind of here. At any rate, so the men went on to Sodom. Abraham is standing before God. And now Abraham, preemptively, we haven't even gotten the record back. He says, very famous, Hitzbes Sadiq im Rasha, will you sweep away the innocent from the guilty? What if there are 50 innocent in the people? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of 50 innocent people? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that the innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? This is chutzpah of the nth degree. How far be who? What? Right? Should not the judge of the earth deal justly? Rabbis call this chutzpah klapei shamayim, chutzpah in the face of heaven, right? And you might even say that God invited this. Because after all, God's opened a conversation and tells Abraham what he's going to do, right? Does God want Abraham to challenge him? And the other thing is, and I think this is enormously important, it doesn't seem to be wrong. The idea of questioning God does not seem to be wrong. Ultimately, Abraham will be shown that the questions, there's an answer, right? And the answer is, at least by the standards of those days, satisfactory. But the idea of, and this question comes up in our own time, right? Questioning God about the Holocaust, for example. How could the judge of the whole earth? Now, we're not saying that it came from God, that Hitler did God's bidding, right? But still, the idea that you can question God's justice when God is supposed to be completely just, I think, is legitimated in this passage, because what does God do? God says, okay, all right, I'll play, right? See, so God's, now also, what is Abraham asking? He's asking for the whole city to be spared for the sake of the 50. Not that the 50 should be removed and then the city can get what it deserves. The idea is that if there's a certain amount of righteousness, they are sustaining the city. This is not like the flood, right? This is, the fact that there's enough 50 people. So God says, okay, if I find 50 people, I'll forgive them. So Abraham, he's not dumb. And listen to his language. Here I venture to speak. I who am but dust and ashes, right? It's a lovely, from shall not the judge of the whole earth do justly? And then God says, okay. And now, he's pressing his luck a little bit, So he wants to see, I'm dust and ashes. I understand. Really shouldn't even say anything. But what about 45? Right. And he says, will you destroy them because of only 5 missing? Right. Right. So God says, I will not destroy it if I find 45. Right. So okay. And then he speaks again and he says, what about 40? And he says, I will not do it for the sake of the 40. And then again, Abraham says, don't let my Lord be angry. What about 30? I won't do it for 30. I venture again to speak. What about 20? And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 20. And he finally says, let not the Lord be angry if I speak. This is the last time. What about 10? And God says, I will not destroy for the sake of 10. And the Lord had finished, and he departed, and Abraham returns to us. Okay. So if you've ever been to the shuk in Israel or any other place where people bargain traditionally, how much is that? No, and you walk away and you come back and the price comes down by a half and then down to a third. And finally so this has that flavor to it, right? There is this kind of back and forth. And Abraham very shrewd, he doesn't go all the way down to begin with. But it stops at 10, which is in itself, I think, quite interesting. Stops at 10, there is a midrash. It's not really even a midrash. It's kind of a story about 10 just men that sustained the world. I don't know if you know this story. Andre Schwartzbart wrote a book about it years and years ago, book of fiction. Anyway, this idea that everyone is saved. The world is preserved for the sake of this small group of people. Sounds a lot like this here. So, the idea of 10, that you need 10 people, would be an obvious example of why you need 10 people for a minyan. But of course, it's not what is chosen. The rabbis want to justify 10 people in a minyan. They don't use this story. They use the story of the 10 scouts, who are the 12 scouts, one from each tribe, sent in to scout out the land. They come back, they have a disastrous report. 10 of them give this disastrous report. The whole people have to sit in the wilderness for 40 years before they can go in. Only 2 of them who are allowed to go in, right? Joshua and Caleb. But it's a tragedy, and it's a tragedy because of the 10. And they say, well, those people are called an Edah, which is the company, congregation also is an Edah. So 10, an Edah is what you need in order to have a minyan. And I once asked the question, many, many years ago, Sandy, you might remember this, why, and I didn't know the answer. Why would it be the scouts, these no-goodniks, rather than here, where they're righteous people? And a guy named Julius Shanison, who was in the class at the time, said to me, Rabbi, if we're going to worry about whether the people in the minyan are righteous, we'll never have a minyan. Right? That the rabbis very wisely chose the passage of 10 terrible people to say, those 10 Jews, nonetheless, if you have them, you have a minyan. Okay, so we're going to stop for a minute. Okay, in terms of this bargaining scene, any comments, thoughts? We're good.
Well,
No, go ahead, Barry.
yeah, so let's assume that God, God certainly knows that there are unrighteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, and let's assume he knows that there are fewer than 10. So God just agrees, okay, if there are 50, not knowing that there are fewer than 10.
So God, you're right, and I think therefore this is a lesson.
Yeah.
Right. That is essentially when we start, I've got to show Abraham about this because he will be right. So the lesson here is that God doesn't do that, right? That God does not, that God doesn't act in a way to destroy an entire community, even if there are good people there. Now, I'll say one other thing about this. It may be that this is, in some ways, on Abraham's part, a special pleading, right? Who's in Sodom? His mishpacha, Lot, who, after all, he went to war in order to save. Right? So even though, right, and it stops at 10, and that in some senses, presumably low, it's not a family of 10, possible, but it's interesting, and it has to be at least in the background, despite the fact that Abraham is speaking in very universalist terms. And I do, because he speaks in such terms, I don't think it's really about that. But there is an element of that which I want to come back to after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, so I don't really think we have time, unfortunately. to do this story. It's really quite long. And I don't think we can just do part of it. Yeah. So we're going to stop. I'm sorry, because I know that we started late, but I really do have to, I have something to go to afterward. Glad to take question. Sandy first, then Saul.
So, Rabbi, excuse me, you said that there's this book about 10 just men,
Yeah.
and I was wondering about, the tradition that the world is sustained always in every generation because of 36 righteous.
Yeah,
How does,
you're right. And that is the book I'm referring to. So I'm wrong.
oh, no, I didn't mean to correct.
Oh, no,
I didn't,
I appreciate
no,
that.
no, I didn't understand how the 10, 36 were related.
Right, right. No, I don't think they are. I think I'm misremembering. I was misremembering. 36 righteous men, twice high. But to not to make too fine a point, right? I do think the concept of a minority preserving the world is being, or community in this case, is being reflected here. And that idea that were it not for those 36, right? Schwartzbard's novels, travels through the generations to look at who these people are and winds up in the Shoah. I read it when I was in high school, I think. It's a really good book. Recommend.
Thank you.
The Last of the Just is the name
Right.
of the book. So,
Getting back to Hachnasat Orchim,
yes.
I believe some of the Meforshim say that Abraham got up and entertained the guests right after his brit.
Right, right. Yeah, so thank you for that. Yes, it's not only that God is doing Bikur Cholim, but Abraham is, he's recovering. And that gives even more strength to the idea that he's standing. Right? He's standing over them. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think once you look at that sequence as being a temporal sequence, it's something else that comes out. And so how much more so that we have here just an extraordinary example of Hachnasat Orchim. Thank you for pointing it out. Any other questions on this or anything really? Okay, yeah, Sandy, go ahead.
As everyone else is, I'm really upset with the Los Angeles fires. I somehow blame God.
Right. Well, right. Well, in some ways, this is what I think of. Okay. And it's my own thing, and I'm not saying you're wrong, right? I think that God creates the world in a certain way. And that if the world is to exist, there's that Goldilocks idea that it can't be too hot, can't be too cold, it's got to be exactly in the right place, that the chances of Earth coming about through some natural process seems so remote, right? Because one little thing could have meant that there wouldn't be life on Earth. Anyway, and so when people talk about earthquakes, for example, if the Earth didn't have a molten core, if we're going to say that God works through physics, right? If the Earth doesn't have a molten core, then none of this, you wouldn't have earthquakes, but you wouldn't have life on Earth either, right? So in some ways, the idea, I think, to me, as I look at it, is you can't have things both ways. There are natural phenomena, and they're going to happen. The problem here with these wildfires is we know, except for those people who want to deny it in the face of all evidence, that this stuff is at least in part a product of climate change. They never had massive fires like this every year. in California, and we're seeing, and not to mention the storms and the tsunamis and on and on and on. So if we want to lay blame, I don't think God is the right place to lay it. And what's worse is we don't seem to be doing what we need to do about it. So, in this case, I'm okay with God, but it's awful. It is utterly awful, and I will be somewhat political here, but instead of scoring political points by blaming the government in California while you're denying climate change at the same time, they really should be doing is giving as much funding to California as they possibly can. But that's one person's opinion. Okay. Anything else?
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So hopefully at the right time next week. Thank you all. And have a great week. I'll see you then.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
What's